It usually starts the same way: a confident voice, a strong opinion, and a sentence that instantly makes Australians pause and blink slowly. Actually, in Australia, and the funny part, the person saying it has never lived there, never gone there, and sometimes can't even point to it on a map. Yet somehow, they are absolutely certain they know more about Australia than Australians themselves. And today, we're diving into one of the internet's most entertaining cultural trends: Americans trying to explain Australia to Australians and unintentionally creating comedy gold in the process. But stick around, because the further this goes, the more unbelievable it gets. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe, like my video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. Now, to be clear, this isn't about hating Americans or mocking curiosity. This is about something very specific: a uniquely confident way of explaining the world, even when the world politely says, yeah, that's not how it works. And Australia seems to be one of the favorite targets. It happens in comment sections, podcasts, YouTube videos, TikToks, interviews, and even casual conversations. An Australian will casually mention something about their own country, and suddenly an American jumps in to correct them about their wildlife, their accent, their laws, their culture, their history, and sometimes their own daily lives. Let's start with wildlife, because this is where it almost always begins. Somehow, Australia has become known online as a place where every single living creature is actively trying to end your existence. According to the internet, Australians wake up every morning dodging spiders the size of dinner plates, wrestling crocodiles on their way to work, and fighting kangaroos before breakfast. So when an Australian casually says, yeah, I've never seen a snake in real life, an American will confidently reply, that can't be true. Australia is basically just snakes and spiders. And that's when Australians collectively sigh. Because yes, Australia has dangerous animals, but so does literally everywhere else. The difference is Australians don't narrate it like an action movie trailer. But Americans explaining this will insist with full confidence that Australians are in constant danger, often while living in places with bears, mountain lions, tornadoes, and hurricanes. And when Australians point that out, the response is usually silence or doubling down. But wildlife is only the beginning. Next comes the accent. This is where things get really interesting. An Australian will speak normally, and an American will say something like, wow, your accent is so strong, to which Australians think, strong compared to what? Reality? Then comes the correction. No, Australians say shrimp on the barbie. That's how you talk. And that's when Australians have to explain, once again, that almost nobody in Australia actually says that. It was a line made famous by an old advertisement aimed at Americans. But the American explaining Australia will insist, no, that's what Australians say. I've seen it in movies. Movies. That's the source. And this happens constantly. Australians explaining their own slang, only to be told they're wrong by someone whose only exposure came from Hollywood. Then we move into culture. This is where confidence truly reaches Olympic levels. Americans will explain that Australia is basically just like America, but upside down. Same values, same lifestyle, same attitudes, just warmer Christmases. Australians try to explain that the cultures are actually quite different, socially, politically, and historically. But the explanation continues anyway. You guys are basically British Texans. That sentence alone has caused emotional damage. Australians will calmly explain that healthcare works differently. Tipping culture doesn't exist the same way. Gun laws are different, and social expectations are not the same. And the American response? Well, that's weird. That wouldn't work in America. Exactly, that's the point. But here's where it gets even funnier: geography. An Australian mentions how long it takes to drive between cities. An American replies, no way, Australia isn't that big. Australia is roughly the same size as the continental United States. When Australians explain this, Americans often respond with disbelief, as if size only counts if you've personally driven. Then come the maps. Australians pointing out that Australia is a continent. Americans saying, no, it's just a country. And when Australians explain that it's both, somehow they're still wrong. But nothing tops the confidence around Australian history. Australians will talk about their colonial past, Indigenous history, and cultural development. An American will jump in with, actually, Australia was founded as a prison, so it doesn't. At that moment, Australians realize this conversation is already lost, because explaining 60,000 years of Indigenous history to someone who just discovered Australia on TikTok is exhausting. And yet, Australians usually respond with humor instead of anger. That's the fascinating part. Rather than arguing, Australians often lean into sarcasm. They'll agree sarcastically. They'll exaggerate the myths. They'll say things like, "Yeah, mate, I just fought a spider on my way to work." And Americans often take it seriously. That's when comment sections explode. Now, why does this happen so often? Part of it is cultural confidence. Americans are raised to speak assertively, present opinions strongly, and explain things with authority, even when unsure. That confidence works incredibly well in many situations. But online, it can turn into explaining other people's lived experiences back to them. Australians, on the other hand, tend to understate things, use irony, and rely heavily on sarcasm. So when Australians say something calmly or jokingly, Americans sometimes assume it needs correcting. And suddenly, you have someone explaining Australia to Australians, but the internet doesn't let this go unnoticed. These moments go viral because they tap into something universal, the absurdity of being told you're wrong about your own life. Everyone can relate to that feeling, and Australians handle it with humor, which only makes the contrast funnier. By the end of these exchanges, Americans are confused, Australians are amused, and viewers are entertained, and that's why this trend keeps going. Not because people want conflict, but because cultural misunderstandings, when handled lightly, become comedy. So, what's the real takeaway here? Australia isn't a movie set. Americans aren't villains, and curiosity isn't a bad thing. But sometimes, listening is more powerful than explaining. And if someone has lived somewhere their entire life, they'd probably know a thing or two about it, even if they don't say shrimp on the Barbie. If you've ever seen an American confidently explain Australia to an Australian, comment below. We need to talk about it. And if you're Australian watching this, let us know the wildest thing someone has confidently told you about your own country, because chances are we wouldn't believe it unless it actually happened. Just when you think the conversation is over, that's when the real chaos begins. Because part 2 doesn't happen in real life. It happens in the comments section. This is where Americans double down, Australians clock in, and the internet chooses violence politely. An Australian will comment something simple like, "Yeah, that's not really how it is here." And within seconds, someone replies, "I've watched multiple documentaries. I think I know." Documentaries, usually narrated by someone who's never lived there either. Then comes the ultimate internet power move. "I have an Australian friend." And suddenly, that one friend becomes the official spokesperson for an entire continent. Australians respond the only way they know how. Dry humor so subtle it goes completely unnoticed. They'll say things like, "Yeah, mate, we all live in the outback and commute by kangaroo." And Americans reply, "See, I told you." That's when other Australians jump in, not to correct, but to escalate the joke. Now there are claims about compulsory spider training in schools, mandatory crocodile awareness exams, and government-issued boomerangs. And the scariest part? Some people still believe it. By this point, Australians aren't even arguing anymore. They're world-building. And honestly, you can't blame them. Because if you're going to be confidently misunderstood, you might as well be entertained by it. And that's why this trend never dies. It's not just about Americans explaining Australia. It's about the internet reminding us that confidence and knowledge are not the same thing. And sometimes the funniest thing you can do is stop explaining and let people believe Australians are out here fist-fighting koalas before work. Because at the end of the day, Australians go to sleep laughing, Americans go to sleep convinced, and the rest of the world just grabs popcorn. And if you made it this far, congratulations. You now know more about Australia than half the internet. Comment below if you want a part 3, because trust me, it somehow gets worse.